They didn't expect me to hear it. That was the first ice-cold certainty that settled in my bones. I was in the kitchen, a place that had been my domain for 40 years, adjusting the angle of the silver serving tray so the light from the window wouldn't glare off its surface. It was an old habit, a small act of care. That's when her voice, light and careless as a feather on the wind, floated in from the dining room. It was just loud enough to snake down the hallway and find me. "Make sure that's her glass," Jessica said. Her tone was conspiratorial, tinged with a brittle amusement. "She'll be out before dessert. I don't want her ruining the toast with one of her little episodes." There was a pause, a pocket of silence that felt heavier than sound. Then my son Michael's muffled voice, too low and indistinct to catch the words, but the cadence was familiar. It was the sound of weary acquiescence, the verbal equivalent of a shrug. Jessica laughed again, a soft, private sound that was more chilling than a shout. "Oh, it's harmless, honey. A little something to help her relax. She'll sleep like a baby. We just need a peaceful evening for once. For the family." I stood completely still, my world narrowing to the four corners of that polished tray. My hand, which had been gently polishing a smudge, gripped the ornate edge of the countertop until my knuckles turned a bloodless white. My heart didn't race. It did something far stranger. It stopped cold for a single terrifying beat, then restarted with a slow, heavy thud, as if it were now pumping not blood, but liquid lead through my veins. Each beat was a reminder that it now carried more weight than before. They were talking about me. My son, my only child, and the woman he married were plotting to drug me in my own home. Slowly, I turned my face toward the small mirror above the stove. It was a ridiculous thing to hang in a kitchen, a small oak-framed square with a hairline crack across the lower left corner. Michael and Jessica had given it to me for Mother's Day, years ago, a piece from some sterile, modern store that didn't fit anywhere else. I saw my own eyes reflected there, calm, flat, unmoving. They were the same eyes I'd seen in the mirror the morning I buried my husband, Robert. They were the same eyes that must have stared back at me when Michael first told me, years ago, with a strained smile, that Jessica has a different way of doing family, Mom. We just have to get used to it. I had gotten used to it. I had adapted, bent, and folded myself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit into the spaces they allowed me. Tonight, that ended. I walked slowly toward the dining room, 10 steps from the counter to the doorway. I counted each one, my feet silent on the worn hardwood floors. They were standing at the head of the table, arranging the cutlery, their heads bent together. They were smiling, their faces masks of domestic bliss, not a trace of their quiet conspiracy anywhere to be seen. Jessica looked up, her smile widening as she saw me. She crossed the small space and kissed Michael on the cheek, a performative little peck, before heading to the hallway to retrieve the wine from the cooler. I didn't say a word. I simply smiled back, a placid, empty expression I had perfected over the years. I walked to the table, picked up the crystal water glasses, mine and hers, and carried them back to the kitchen as if to top them off. I poured fresh, cool water into each, the sound echoing in the profound silence of the room. When I returned to the dining room, Jessica was still gone. With a single fluid motion, a quiet act completely unnoticed, I switched them, her glass for mine, mine for hers. It was my house, even if they treated it like a convenient, well-decorated stage for their lives. They'd insisted on hosting this anniversary dinner here. "It's cozier, more traditional," Jessica had argued, her voice slick with false deference. "Besides, Eleanor, you've got the best dining room. Our apartment is just too stark." What she meant was that my home, filled with the warmth of a life well lived, looked respectable and familiar in a way their cold, minimalist apartment never could. What she meant was that their sleek grays and sharp-edged furniture didn't feel like family. What she really meant was that I and my home were good for appearances. I set the glasses back on the table, mine now placed at her seat, and sat down, smoothing the front of my simple navy dress. A moment later, Jessica returned, holding a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon like a trophy. "Your favorite, Eleanor," she announced, the sound of my name in her mouth always tasting slightly bitter, like an unwelcome medicine. I nodded, my smile unwavering. "Lovely." The others arrived one by one. My older grandson Liam distracted as always, his eyes darting to the screen of his phone every few minutes. My younger granddaughter Chloe, polite and sweet, her heart still soft and untarnished. She immediately started helping with the napkins without being asked, her quiet presence a small balm on my fractured spirit. The table filled, the candles flickered. The roast I had spent all afternoon preparing cooled slightly while Jessica fussed about the lighting, adjusting the dimmer switch until the atmosphere was just right for her performance. Then came the first sip. Jessica raised her glass, the one I now knew held more than wine, for a toast. "To family," she said, her eyes sweeping over us all but lingering on me for a fraction of a second too long. "To patience, and to keeping things civil." The strange phrasing earned a few confused glances from the children. Michael offered a tight, forced chuckle, and a silence lingered in the air, thick and uncomfortable. She drank, a deep, self-satisfied swallow. I watched the muscles in her throat move, then I picked up my own glass, her intended glass, and raised it slightly in acknowledgement. I didn't drink. Dinner began. The conversation flowed around me, a river of meaningless chatter about school, promotions, a potential vacation to Italy someone might take in July. No one spoke directly to me, except when Jessica turned and said brightly, her voice dripping with faux concern, "I do hope the food isn't too salty for your blood pressure, Eleanor." I met her gaze and smiled, a genuine cold curve of my lips. "We'll find out, won't we?" She didn't catch the tone. She never did. She was too insulated by her own self-importance to ever recognize a threat. 20 minutes later, the first signs appeared. She started blinking more often, a long, slow flutter of her lashes. She rubbed her temple with perfectly manicured fingers and began sipping her water with increasing frequency. Her fork, which had been moving with brisk efficiency, slowed its journey from her plate to her mouth. "Are you all right, dear?" I asked, my voice gentle, almost kind. It was the voice of a concerned mother-in-law. "Fine," she mumbled, shaking her head as if to clear it. "Just a little tired." Another 10 minutes passed. The vibrant color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin pale and waxy in the candlelight. Her posture, usually ramrod straight, had slackened. Her words began to slur, just enough for everyone to notice, but not enough for anyone to dare comment. The unease at the table was palpable. Then, with a soft sigh, she slumped sideways in her chair, her head lolling against her shoulder. Liam jumped up, his phone forgotten. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Jessica?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I rose slowly from my chair, my movements deliberate. I took her wine glass, the source of her sudden ailment, and carried it back to the kitchen. I poured the remaining contents down the drain, the dark liquid swirling away into the pipes, taking the evidence with it. I didn't say a single word. They laid her on the living room couch and someone called an ambulance. The diagnosis, I knew, would be something mundane. Exhaustion, low blood sugar, perhaps stress. No one would ask what was really in that glass, and I would certainly say nothing. I didn't need to. Michael didn't ride in the ambulance with his wife. He stayed back, dazed, muttering something about how she'd been working too much, burning the candle at both ends. After the medics left, their presence a brief, jarring intrusion into the quiet drama. The house was silent again. I walked him to the door. "You should get some rest too, Mom," he said, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He was looking at the floor, at the wall, at anything but the woman whose quiet dignity he had been willing to sacrifice for a peaceful evening. "I will," I replied, my voice even. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Michael," I said, my voice just loud enough to stop him in his tracks. He froze, his hand on the doorknob. He turned back slowly. "I heard you." Just that. Nothing more. His face crumpled. Understanding, shame, and fear warred in his eyes. He didn't say a word. He just walked out into the cool night air, and I closed the door, locking it behind him. The silence that followed their departure was different. It wasn't peaceful, not yet. It wasn't sad. It was full. It was the feeling of something heavy having finally landed after being suspended in the air for years, threatening to fall. I sat in the living room, my hands folded neatly on my lap, and watched the darkness settle over the porch. Jessica's perfume, some expensive, sharp floral she always wore too much of, lingered faintly on the sofa cushions. Even unconscious, she managed to leave her insistent mark. I expected to feel guilt. I braced myself for some trembling in my hands, some shadow of doubt in my heart. But all I felt was a profound, startling clarity, as if a dense fog I hadn't even realized I was walking through had suddenly lifted. I picked up the abandoned wine glasses, the plates of half-eaten food, and began clearing the table. The roast had gone completely cold, the green beans limp and forgotten. Chloe had taken her napkin and folded it into a perfect little triangle before leaving. That girl had a good heart. I prayed she would survive this family with it intact. In the kitchen, I scrubbed the dishes with methodical care, the rhythm of the task soothing and familiar. It was just like any other night, except that everything had changed. And it didn't begin tonight. It began long before I could even put a name to it. Years ago, I would have laughed at the idea of such a scene, that my son's wife would try to drug me with a sleeping supplement just to keep me quiet during a family dinner. But years ago, I used to believe that love and kindness were the only currencies a family needed. Jessica's dislike for me had been a slow poison, administered in subtle homeopathic doses at first, gentle corrections about my speech in front of her friends. "You mean salmon, not salmon, Eleanor. It's pronounced croissant, not crescent." Then came the larger, more invasive critiques. "You really should stay out of our parenting choices. We have a different approach." Or, "Eleanor, your decor is so nostalgic." It was code for outdated, lower class, an embarrassment to her carefully curated image. She came from money, but not old money. It was flashy, new money, the kind that shouts its existence through designer clothes, weekly spa visits, and a car that cost more than my paid-off house. And somehow, despite all that wealth, they were always just one step away from financial disaster. That's where I came in. My son Michael was no better. He never defended me, never contradicted her. He just played the role of the beleaguered peacemaker. "She doesn't mean it like that, Mom. Jessica's just stressed. You're being too sensitive. Let's not make a big thing out of it." For years, I didn't make a thing out of it. I made my world smaller. I swallowed my pride. I signed checks. I helped with the down payment on their sprawling house in the suburbs. I covered the exorbitant private school fees when Liam started falling behind. I quietly paid off their credit card debt one winter after they asked for a small favor to get them through the holidays. I never told anyone. That was my mistake. They didn't see it as generosity. They saw it as an utility. They got used to it. They started acting like it was expected, like I owed it to them simply for the privilege of being their mother and grandmother. And I took it all because Michael was my only child, because Robert was gone, and I was so terrified of being truly alone. I thought if I kept giving, if I stayed useful, eventually I'd be a real part of their lives again. Not just a backup wallet and an emergency babysitter, but a mother, a grandmother, I thought my utility would guarantee my place. Tonight proved otherwise. They didn't just want me silent. They wanted me unconscious, out of the picture, a bothersome obstacle to their flawless performance of unity and upper-class polish. I washed Jessica's wine glass last. I watched the soap run down the delicate stem over the rim where her dark lipstick had left a faint, waxy mark. I rinsed it carefully, the crystal squeaking clean in my hands, and set it on the rack to dry. Then I wiped down the counters until they shone, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. I didn't sleep. My mind replayed their conversation in an endless, torturous loop. Her voice so confident and careless, talking about me like I was a household pest to be tranquilized and removed. Michael's weak, complicit silence. For years, I had said nothing. When they left me off the family Christmas card, sending one signed only from the Millers. When they told the new neighbors that I was just a friend helping out with childcare. When I offered a piece of advice and received a patronizing smile in return, I swallowed it all. Not anymore. The next morning, I dressed without rushing. I followed my usual routine: soft wool slacks, a cashmere cardigan, the small silver brooch my Robert gave me on our last anniversary. I made tea and sat by the kitchen window. The garden needed weeding, but I let it be. Today was not for pulling weeds. It was for severing roots. My phone buzzed at precisely 9:17 a.m. It was a message from Chloe. "Grandma, is everything okay? Last night was so weird. Dad said Jessica fainted because she hadn't eaten all day, but I don't know. She looked strange. Are you okay?" A small, sad smile touched my lips. "Bless that girl," I replied. "I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart. Thank you for checking on me." And yes, something was very strange. I didn't say more. Not yet. She deserved the truth, but not in a text message. I would talk to her soon, face to face. I spent the rest of the morning at my desk, reviewing my bank statements online. 3 accounts, 1 savings, 1 checking, and a money market account I hadn't touched in over a year. My name was on every document, and Michael's was on several as a co-signer or authorized user. I had forgotten how many of their bills I had automated in my name over the years. Their cell phones, their car insurance, the school fees, a ridiculously expensive gym membership I knew Jessica had never used. It was all there in black and white, a digital ledger of my own slow erasure. They used my money to build their perfect life, and then they tried to drug me to remove me from it. I closed the laptop gently and picked up the phone. I called the bank. The voice on the other end was young and chipper, too bright for 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. "And good morning. You've reached First Federal of Maple Creek. This is Colleen. How can I assist you today?" I paused, my hand resting on a notepad where I'd scribbled down every recurring payment I could remember. My handwriting, I noticed, looked steadier than I felt. "Yes. Hello, Colleen. My name is Eleanor Vance. I need to review some authorizations on my accounts, and I'd like to suspend a number of automatic transfers, possibly all of them." There was a beat of silence on the other end. "Of course, Miss Vance. I can certainly assist with that. May I just verify your identity first?" We went through the standard dance of security questions, the last 4 digits of my social security number, the name of my late husband, the answer to a question about my childhood street that I'd forgotten I'd even set. "Perfect," she said finally, her tone now more serious. "I see you have 3 active accounts with us. There are currently 72 automatic transactions scheduled each month. Would you like to cancel specific ones or suspend everything for now?" "Everything," I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd half expected it to, for a tremor of fear or regret to betray me, but it came out clear and steady. It was the voice of a woman I almost didn't recognize. "All right," Colleen replied, the professional seriousness in her voice, a strange comfort. I am initiating a suspension of all scheduled payments and transfers from your accounts, effective immediately. They will be paused until we receive further instructions from you in writing or in person at one of our branches." I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the silent phone. So that's how it starts, I thought. Not with a shouting match, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet call to a cheerful stranger, a simple flip of a switch in some distant, invisible system. The financial lifeblood I had been pumping into their lives, their real dependency on me, was now cut off. By lunchtime, the first text came through. It was from Michael. "Hey, Mom, did something happen with the phone plan? Mine's not working." I didn't answer. I let him wonder. I made myself a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on rye, nothing fancy, and took it out to the porch. I sat in the old wicker chair with the peeling white paint on the armrest, the one Jessica always made a subtle face at. Funny, I thought, that worn-out armrest had outlasted her decency. The September air was warm, a little sticky. I watched a neighbor mow his lawn in slow, careful stripes and remembered how Robert used to do the same, taking pride in the neatness of the lines. I wondered what he would have said about all this. He wouldn't have been surprised. He saw things I didn't, or perhaps things I refused to see. He'd warned me gently years ago, his hand covering mine as we sat on this very porch. "Ellie," he'd said, his voice rumbling with affection and concern, "if they only come around when there's a check involved, they're not visiting you. They're visiting the bank." Back then, I'd brushed it off, telling him he was being cynical. Now, I knew he was just being honest. He was just tired of watching me get chipped away, piece by piece. Around 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I knew before I opened it who it would be. Michael. His shirt was wrinkled, which was unusual for him. Jessica always ensured he was impeccably dressed. His hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was uncombed. He looked like a man who had been chasing an explanation all morning and still hadn't caught it. "Mom," he said, stepping inside before I could invite him in or turn him away. "I need to ask you something." I didn't offer him a seat. He stood awkwardly in the living room, glancing around as if he were looking for the source of a strange noise. Did you talk to the bank?" "I did," I said calmly. "Why?" He asked it like it was a genuine question, like my actions were a complete and utter mystery. "You know why, Michael." His face shifted, flickering through a sequence of emotions: irritation, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name, perhaps fear. Then it settled into that careful, measured expression he used when dealing with difficult clients at his law firm. He clasped his hands together in front of him. "Mom, look. Jessica has been under a lot of stress lately. She didn't mean anything by what she said. It was just poor wording. She was nervous about the evening going smoothly, that's all." "You're calling an attempt to drug me poor wording?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "She didn't drug you," he said quickly, his eyes widening in a pantomime of shock. "You're jumping to conclusions. It was just a supplement, melatonin. She uses it herself sometimes. She thought it might help you relax. She put something in my glass without my knowledge or consent," I stated, each word a cold, hard stone. He hesitated, the lie catching in his throat. Yes, okay, that part was not great. I almost laughed, the sheer breathtaking inadequacy of the phrase. Not great. I said nothing. I just stood there, my arms folded across my chest, waiting to see how deep a hole he would dig for himself. He exhaled, a long, frustrated sigh. "Look, I'm not saying it was the right call, but we thought, that sometimes these dinners get a little tense. You know how you get." "How I get?" I repeated, my voice still level. "You make these comments, Mom, about her, about the house, the kids. I pay for the house, I interrupted. That stopped him cold. I paid the down payment. I paid the mortgage, Michael. Every single month for 6 years after you were laid off and before you started your own firm. I paid for the kids' school, your car insurance, Jessica's emergency medical bills last year. I paid for your groceries when your credit card was declined at the supermarket last spring. I know because the bank called me to authorize the charge. So, if I made a few comments over dinner, I think I've more than earned the right. His mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing he could say. You have taken my money, I said, my voice finally rising, filled with the cold fire of years of suppressed resentment. And in return, you and your wife tried to put me to sleep like an inconvenient child so you could have a peaceful party. It wasn't like that, he started, his voice weak. Was it your idea, Michael? I asked, pinning him with my gaze. Or did you just stand there, listen to her say it, and stay quiet? He didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence was the only confession I needed. We stood in the heavy silence of my living room for a long moment. Finally, he asked, his voice softer now, defeated. So that's it. You're cutting us off? From the kitchen, the tea kettle began to whistle, a shrill, piercing cry that sliced through the tension. I turned calmly and walked away from him. I'm cutting myself loose, I said over my shoulder as I went to pour myself a cup. I used to think silence was strength. I believed that if I just kept the peace, held my tongue, and smiled when I was hurting, I was being noble. That's what good mothers did. They endured. That's what decent women did. They forgave. It was better to be unthanked than to be bitter. That was the litany I had repeated to myself for years. That was before I saw my only son standing in my living room, trying to explain away a drugged wine glass as if it were a simple social slip-up. After he left, without tea and without a real apology, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the steam rising from my cup. It curled into the air like a quiet, final goodbye. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years. That used to bother me, this strange dryness in my soul. Now I saw it as proof that I had finally stopped expecting tenderness from the very people who should have known best how to give it. The next day, I opened the bottom drawer in the hallway console table, the one I hadn't looked through in years. It held a jumble of old files, appliance warranties, loose batteries, and a thick manila envelope with Michael's name written on it in my familiar looping handwriting. I emptied its contents onto the dining room table. There they were, the receipts of my devotion, copies of checks, loan agreements that were never repaid, birthday cards with, "Thank you for everything, Mom," scribbled next to numbers that had more zeros than any gift should ever require. 17 years of generosity. No, I corrected myself. 17 years of trying to buy my place in a family that had slowly, methodically decided I was merely optional. I picked up one check for $6,200, the memo line labeled nursery furniture. That was when Jessica was pregnant with Liam. She had cried on the phone, her voice thick with manufactured despair, saying she didn't want her precious baby to sleep in second-hand junk. I wired the money the same day. There was another for $12,000 listed as a bridge loan until my bonus comes through. The bonus never did. And there was the biggest one, a cashier's check for $45,000, the down payment on their house. They had celebrated with champagne that night. I remember because Michael sent me a photo of the cork with the caption, "Wouldn't have popped this without you, Mom." I never printed that photo. It wasn't just the money. It was the 1,000 tiny cuts. Jessica had a special talent for correcting me in front of others. "Eleanor, I think you meant to say autumnal, not just fall. It sounds more refined." Or, "Don't tell the kids those old stories about your childhood. They're a little dated." Michael would just laugh, as if her condescension was a charming quirk. They never shouted, never raised a hand, just chipped away at me with a slow, soft erosion until I started to doubt my own mind, my own worth, my own place at the table. So, I stayed quiet. When Liam forgot to call me on my birthday, I told myself he was a busy teenager. When Chloe's dance recital went by without an invitation, I pretended I hadn't heard about it from a neighbor. When Jessica planned holidays and family vacations without so much as asking if I was free, I made other plans alone, because it was easier than making a scene. Because I foolishly believed that one day they'd come around. They didn't. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen and began writing. Not a letter. Not yet. I made a list of payments, of dates, of patterns of behavior. It was long and damning. At the bottom of the third page, I drew a firm line and wrote one single sentence. A person's worth is not measured by what they give, but by how they are treated when they stop giving. Then I picked up the phone and called Chloe. She answered on the second ring. Grandma? Her voice was bright but cautious, as if she wasn't sure if she was calling into a storm. That uncertainty, that fear of my reaction, hurt more than anything else. Hi, sweetheart, I said, my voice warm and steady. You asked me yesterday if everything was okay. Yeah, you seem different. I need to tell you something, I said. But not over the phone. Can you come by after school? Of course, she said immediately. Do you want me to bring anything? Just yourself, I replied. She came that afternoon, walking into the house with her usual quiet respect, her backpack slung over one shoulder and that little frown of concentration on her face that she got when she was thinking hard. We sat at the kitchen table. I didn't offer her snacks or ask about school. I just told her the truth. About the glass, about what I overheard, about what I did in response. She listened without speaking, her eyes wide, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When I finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, her voice barely a whisper, "She's been weird with you for years." That surprised me. I first noticed it when I was maybe 10, she continued. I remember you gave me a sweater for my birthday, and she told me later it wasn't my style and made me give it away. Dad just let her. I nodded slowly, a deep sadness settling in my chest. I am so sorry, Chloe. You don't need to be, she said, her gaze firm. You didn't do any of it. She took a breath, then asked the question that hung in the air between us. What happens now? I'm not sure, I said honestly. But it's going to be different. She didn't push for more details. She just reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her hand was small and warm in mine, a silent promise of solidarity. That night I wrote a letter. Not to Michael, not yet. I wrote it to my lawyer. I asked for an appointment to discuss my will and estate, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night.